So we're on DAF Hey Amud Aleph, and what we were learning about yesterday is that when you read the Megillah early, because you're a villager, that only permits you to read the Megillah early, and also Matanos Levyonim. However, everything else, all the other aspects of Purim, specifically the Sudas Purim, Simcha, you have to do on the 14th, on Purim day itself. We're on the top line of DAF Hey Amud Aleph, Amar Rav, Megillah Bizmana Koronosa Filu B'Yachid, Shalo Bizmana Ba'asara. So Rav says a psak, and he says that when you read the Megillah on Purim proper, because you're not, because you're not reading it earlier on the 11th, 12th, or 13th, so then you can read it even without a minyan. But if you're reading it earlier, you're a villager reading it on 11th, 12th, or 13th, you must have a minyan present in order to read it. Rav Asi Omar Bein Bizmana Bein Shalo Bizmana Ba'asar. Rav Asi says, regardless of whether you're reading it on its proper time or not on its proper time, meaning on the 14th or earlier, you always need to have a minyan. And Rashi points out that this is a lechatchila. It's not, of course, b'diavad. Let's say you're somewhere in China on Purim day. Of course, Rav Asi is not telling you not to read the Megillah. He's just telling you that lechatchila, you're obligated to have a minyan no matter where you read the Megillah. And the truth is that even though that's the way we pass in lechatchila also. You should always, we say barovam, you should always try to have the Megillah read as in a populace. So there was once a Maisa where Rav was by himself on Purim day, and he was choshesh for Rav Asi Shita, so he gathered together 9 other people to make sure that he would have the minyan when he read the Megillah. So now the Gemara says, Umi Amar Rav Hachi. So since when did Rav say that you should be choshesh for Rav Asi Shita? That lechatchila you should have the minyan. V'ha'amar Rav Yehuda Bereid Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas Mishmei de Rav. Look at what was quoted in the name of Rav. Purim shechalios b'Shabbos, erev Shabbos zmanam. The statement is a little bit bizarre, so we have to unpack it. But the statement is that when Purim falls out on Shabbos, the proper time is Friday. The proper time for Purim is Friday. So the Gemara says, what do you mean, erev Shabbos zmanam v'ha Shabbos zmanam? What do you mean the proper time for Purim is Friday? You just got through telling me that the 14th of Adar is on Saturday. So it doesn't make any sense. It's one thing to say that you should read it on Friday, but to tell me that that's its proper time, that's not its proper time. It's that you're preceding it by one day because you can't read it on Shabbos. So Elalav, Hachikamar. So what it sounds like Rav is trying to tell us is, Shalo bizmanam kizmanam. Mazmanam afilu biyachid, af shalo bizmanam afilu biyachid. It sounds like Rav is coming to be makel, is coming to give us a kula, that even when you're reading the Megillah earlier, because of whatever heter, whatever situation, like Purim is on Shabbos, just like you're makel on the 14th, you can also be makel on the days that you're reading the Megillah that are not the 14th. And therefore the Gemara's assumption is that what Rav seems to be saying is that just like you can read it as an individual on the 14th, you can also read it as an individual without a minyan before the 14th. So the question is, how can Rav have been quoted as saying that when you're reading the Megillah at the wrong time, not on the 14th, you must have a minyan present? It seems very clear that Rav is paskening that you don't need to have a minyan even when you're reading it earlier.
Once Chazal changed the Zman for that year because it's Shabbos, it becomes Zmano, doesn't it?
That's an interesting thought. In other words, maybe you'd make a distinction as follows. Rav is talking about when you're a villager and everyone else is reading it on the 14th. Mm-hmm. And here, everyone's reading it on the Friday. Mm-hmm. It's a good chiluk, but that's not the chiluk that the Gemara makes. The Gemara gives a different answer, telling me that that's not even what Rav was talking about. Rav, you're making an assumption about what Rav was saying, and that's not at all what he was saying. Lo le'inyan mikra Megillah ba'asara. No, what Rav is telling you is that when you read the Megillah on Friday, which is the 13th of Adar, not the 14th of Adar, he's saying you need to read it with the minyan. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the time for reading the Megillah is on the 13th, and make sure that you have a minyan, because he's being consistent that since you're not reading it on the 14th, you must have a minyan. But then the language doesn't make any sense. Elamai Erev Shabbos Manam. So then why did he use that language of saying that's its proper time? Isn't that equating it to the 14th? No. That's not what Rav meant to do. La'afuki midarebi da'amar hol v'nitchu ayaros mimakoman Yidachu liyom haknisa. Kamash malan de'erev Shabbos manamhu. It's coming to exclude that brisa which we learned where Rebbe was cited, and the brisa had told us that once you're not reading the Megillah on its proper day, which is Shabbos, push it back to Thursday, which is the day, the marketplace day. And that's what Rav is telling us, that we don't paskin like that brisa. We paskin instead that you read it at the day immediately preceding Zmanam. That's its time, to exclude the time being Thursday. So it's got nothing to do with equating reading it on the 13th to reading it on the 14th as far as a minyan, not a minyan. That's got nothing. Rav's statement had nothing to do with that. It was you were totally off base, is what the Gemara is replying. So therefore, Rav's statement stands that when you read it on Purim Day itself, technically you don't need a minyan, but when you're reading it on any day earlier than Purim, you do need to have a minyan. That's the way the Gemara's conclusion is as far as Rav's psak halacha. Next Mishnah. Ezo hi'ir gedola. So we remember the Mishnah had made a distinction between large cities and villages. Villages can read it earlier to go to the Yom HaKanisa, to go to the marketplace. And it's an accommodation that we make for villagers. But if you live in a large city, you don't have such an accommodation. So now we need to define the difference. What is the definition of a large city? And what's the definition of a village? So kol sheyesh ba asara batlonim. Any city that has 10 men of leisure. Now, 10 men of leisure is not a derogatory term. It means that these are people who are available for religious services for the Jewish community. If you have 10 people, it almost sounds like it's a kollel, but we'll see the Gemara is going to clarify this. If these 10 people are available to the religious community to accommodate the needs of the community, then that means that the community is large enough to be called a krach, to be called a large city. Pachos mikan hareza kfar. If it's smaller than that, you don't have 10 men of leisure, so then it is a village. Now, it's the word batlonim, the way we use it today, is a derogatory connotation, but it's not meant to, in a derogatory fashion here. A batlon, we mean, is a guy who's a ne'er-do-well, a lazy guy who doesn't do anything. But that's not what it means here. It means a person who is designated by the Jewish community to be available for religious services. And the Gemara will explain. So the Gemara now says, Be'ilu amrim makdimim v'lo ma'achrin. So the next halacha that the Mishnah tells us that only when it comes to the laws of Megillah reading do we say that if you can't do it, or there's a reason not to do it on Purim Day, you do it earlier, but you're not allowed to do it later. But aval zman atse kohanim v'ha'am v'tisha b'av chagiga v'hakel ma'achrin v'lo makdimin. But the following halachos, if you can't do it on that day, then you do it the day later, not the day before. This is a contrast. So what are the examples? We learned in Maseches Tainis that there were specific days on the calendar year when there were families that brought gifts of wood to the Beis HaMikdash, and they brought karbanos on those days. Well, you can't do that on Shabbos. So if that date coincides with Shabbos, you push it off to the following day, not the day before. And the same thing with Tisha B'Av. If Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos, as it quite often does, you push it off to Sunday. And Chagiga, Korban Chagiga, we know that you have, on Yontif, you're supposed to bring a special Korban Shlomim as an individual, which you cannot do on Shabbos. And therefore, if the first day of Yontif is on a Shabbos, you push it off to the following day. The Hakel. And the mitzvah of Hakel is that once every 7 years, it turns out it's the year after the Shemitah year, on Sukkot, on the day after Yontif, the king of Israel is supposed to stand up on a wooden platform in the center of the courtyard temple, the temple courtyard, and read the Sefer Torah for the entire populace. You can't do that on Shabbos. There are two reasons for that. Number one is because you can't set up a platform on Shabbos. And number two, you need to bring your children. And you can't carry children on Shabbos to the Beis HaMikdash.
Nowhere for Kiddush Club either.
Well, that's going to be a problem. Every Shabbos you want to come to the Beis HaMikdash. Anyway, so unless the Kohanim may have had a Kiddush club, I don't know. But in any event, but they couldn't make Kiddush. They probably just had meat. So anyway, so it was an alcohol-free Kiddush club. Anyway, so ma'achrin v'lo makdimin. So for them, if the day of Hakel, which is the first day Chol HaMoed, if that falls out on Shabbos, so then you push it off to the following day. So Afal Pisha Amru Makdimin V'lo Ma'achrin Mutarin Behesped V'Tainas Umatanas Levyona. So, and then the next thing the Mishnah says is that, there are villagers who are allowed to read the Megillah on days earlier, on 11, 12, or 13 of Adar. However, just because we're telling them to read the Megillah on that day doesn't mean it's Mamish Purim for all celebratory purposes. It's only Purim as far as reading the Megillah and Matanos Levyonim, but for the celebratory aspect, you're allowed to still have Hespedim, you're allowed to have eulogies, and you're allowed to fast on those days. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Emasai, Makom Shenichnasim B'Sheni V'Chamishi. Aval Makom Shenichnasim Lo B'Sheni V'Lo B'Chamishi Ein Karanosa Ela Bizmana. So Rabbi Yehuda, we quoted from this Mishnah yesterday. Rabbi Yehuda had said, when do we say that villagers can read it earlier on the Yom HaKenisa? Only when it's in a region where there are large cities which have marketplace days on Mondays and Thursdays. So then we allow them to go to the marketplace, and we're not matriach them. We don't burden them to have to go back to the big city a second time to hear Megillah, since they're already going to be there Monday and Thursday. But if you live in a region where the marketplace days are not fixed on Mondays and Thursdays, so then there is no heter for the village folk to read the Megillah earlier. Okay, let's take a look at the Gemara. Tana, Asara Batlanim Shebebeis HaKnesses. So the Brisa just clarifies for us, when we talk about Asara Batlanim, 10 people who are men of leisures, it means that they're free in the synagogue. In other words, and it's fascinating because it's not a kollel the way we think of a kollel today of 10 people learning in the Beis Medrash. This is dafka 10 men who are available to make a minyan. And like Rashi tells us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gets very upset if he comes to shul when it's time to daven and there's no minyan present. So when a Jewish community always guarantees that there's a minyan, that's what Asara Batlanim means. So if you live in a city where there's never any problem finding a minyan, so that's what you fulfilled the criterion of Asara Batlanim, at least it sounds like according to Rashi. If you live in a community where you got to make phone calls, you got to wait, and all of these other things.
The guy's Jewish.
Right. Yeah. Du bist a Yid. At center. Right. So then it's called the kfar. Then it's called the village. So that's the difference. Okay. So the Gemara now says, Be'elu amr makdim v'lo ma'achrin. So only when it comes to Megillah do we say you read it a day earlier, not a day later. My time. Well, what's the reason? So Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, Amar Kra v'lo ya'avor. Because the Megillah says that you cannot trespass, you cannot go beyond the dates of Purim. So therefore it's quite clear in the verbiage of the story of Megillah Esther that the Chazal did not want you to read it any later than Purim. That's not really giving us a reason, it's just giving us a scriptural citation, but we'd have to work out homiletically exactly what is the imperative of reading the Megillah early. Ba'amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Shmuel, minayin she'in monim yamim l'shanim. Another statement that was made by Rabbi Abba in the name of Shmuel was that how do you know that when you count years, you don't use days as your criterion, but rather use months as the criterion. Now what do we mean by that? There are certain halachic issues that would come up when you use a year as a unit of time. For example, let's say a person takes a neder, and he says, I'm not going to drink wine for a year. Okay? Fine. So what's the definition of a year? You could say, well, it's 365 days if you want to use a solar year. Or you could say it's 354 days if you wanted to use a lunar year. But the answer is neither of those are accurate, because it's actually 12 months. It's 12 months, and therefore you count 12 months. So if a person, for example, made his neder on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, he'd have 12 months until the following Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and therefore even if that year was less than 354 days, because the Beis Din was Makadesh al Pi HaRe'iyah, so they made more months chaser than Malay, so therefore let's say this year was only 353 days, then your neder would be over at Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the following year. And you don't have to be concerned about the number of days that have elapsed.
If it's a leap year, you would end a month earlier.
And if it's a leap year, you'd have to go according to, well, that's a good question. Rashi doesn't discuss that issue. If you say a year, do you mean 12 months or do you mean 13 months? That's not clarified by Rashi. But the point that Rashi is making is to distinguish between months and days. As far as what the status of a leap year is, then we'd have to go according to the vernacular of the way people speak. It's an interesting shaila. Shenamar l'chodshei hashana chadoshim atamona l'shanim v'atamona yomim l'shanim. And how do you know this? Because the Torah says it connects the months to the years. To tell me that months are the unit of time to gauge how much a year is and not days. And v'rabbanim de kesari mishum Rabbi Abba Omer minayin shein mechashvin shos l'chadoshim. In a similar vein, you never use hours to gauge the unit of time that we call a month. Now let's clarify this. How much is a lunar cycle, which defines a halachic month in the Jewish law? A lunar month, a lunar cycle, is 29 days, 12 hours, and 44 minutes. Okay? Now, let's say a person takes a neder, he's not going to drink wine for a month. So, when is the neder over? Is it over after 29 days, 44 minutes, 12 hours and 44 minutes? No. It's if this month is a chaser month, so then it's 29 days, and then the neder's over. The example Rashi gives also is if a guy gives his wife a get, and he says, this get will take effect at the end of this month, at the end in a month. If I don't come back from my trip in a month, you are hereby divorced. So let's say he gets back after 29 days and 3 hours, let's say. So the halacha is she'll be divorced because since this month on the Jewish calendar is 29 days, pinklach 29 days, then once the month is over, she's divorced, regardless of the fact that he came back within the lunar cycle period. Shenamar ad chodesh yamim. And how do you know this? Because again, the scripture connects a month to days and not to hours. Yomim atem machashiv l'chadashim, v'yatem machashiv shos l'chadashim. That we only use days as units of time to increment up to a month. We don't use hours as units of time. Next, avolzman atse kohanim v'tisha b'av v'chagiga v'hakil ma'achron v'lo makdimin. When it came to these other halachos of the date of giving the wood sacrifice, of Tisha B'av, of Korban Chagiga, of Hakel, if you can't do it on that day because it's Shabbos, you push it off to the following day, not to the day before. So Tisha B'av, Agdumi Parnas Lo Makadmi. So why? Why is it by these things? So for Tisha B'av, the answer is very simple. You always delay suffering. You don't predate suffering. So if I can't do Tisha B'av today, I can't fast today because it's Shabbos, I'm not going to push it to the day before. I always push it. You always delay suffering as much as you can. And Chagiga v'Hakel mishum dakati lo matazman chiyuvayu. And what about Chagiga and Hakel? And really you have to add the Korban Eitzim in here as well, is because the time of obligation has not yet arrived. Now what we mean by that is the Torah is very clear. On Yantif, bring a Korban Chagiga. Let's say the first day of Yantif is Shabbos. What are you going to tell me? Bring it Erev Yantif? That's not the date when the Torah wants me to bring a Korban Chagiga. It's a gift offering to God because of the holiday, and it's not the holiday yet. The same thing is true with Hakel. The Torah is very specific. Bring it on the second day of Sukkot. If today's not the second day of Sukkot, how can I predate it? And the same thing was true, what Rashi would say, would be by the Korban Eitzim. The families had made pledges to bring wood at specific dates. You can't fulfill your pledge if you bring it prematurely. You can only fulfill your pledge once that date elapses. And so those are the reason why you always do it the day after. Tana, Chagiga v'chol zman Chagiga ma'achron. Now we have a very simple brisa, which is a 5-word brisa. But we have to sort of understand what the brisa means. It says Chagiga, and the entire time of Chagiga, you always delay. Now, what do those words mean? So, Bishlama Chagiga di'imikla b'shabta ma'achron la lebasar Shabbata. I understand the first part, which is when you have a Korban Chagiga to bring on Yantif, but today is Shabbos, so you delay it one day and you bring it on Sunday, which will be the second day of Yantif. That makes perfectly good sense. Elazman Chagiga Mahi. But what does the last part of the brisa mean when it says that the Zman Chagiga is also delayed? What do those words mean? So, Amar Rav Oshia Hachika Amar. Rav Oshia says, I'll tell you what it means. Chagiga b'Shabbos va'olas re'iyah afilu b'yom tov dizman chagiga ma'acharin. What it means is as follows, says Rav Oshia. There are 2 special karbanos that every individual Jew has an obligation to bring on Yantif. One is called the Korban Chagiga, which is a Korban Shlomim, which means that a portion of that animal is on the Mizbeach, but the rest of it is eaten by the owner. There's another mitzvah that the Torah says there's another korban called an olas re'iyah. The Torah says, V'lo yeira'u fanai rekam, that you shall not appear to me empty-handed, which means, Chazal say it means, that in addition to the korban chagiga, which is v'samachta b'chagecha, you rejoice by eating meat, there's also a mitzvah to bring a separate animal as a burnt offering, which is completely burnt to Hashem on the Yontif. That's called olas re'iyah. And what the Brisa means to tell me is that when Shabbos coincides with the first day of Yontif, you delay bringing the korban chagiga, because a korban chagiga can only be brought on Yontif, it may not be brought on Shabbos. And then the second thing it's saying is when you need to bring an olas re'iyah, even if the first day of Yontif is not Shabbos, and therefore you're able to bring the korban chagiga, you may not bring the olas re'iyah until after Yontif, until Chol HaMoed. Why? Because umani beishamai, that our Mishnah goes according to Beis Shammai, who says that a burnt offering may not be brought on Yontif, because Beis Shammai say that you're only allowed to bring karbanos that you yourself can eat on Yontif, because the Torah only gives you a heter to bring karbanos when they're lochem, when you can partake of them yourself. Ditnan Beis Shammai omrim mevi'in shlomim b'Yontif vein somchen aleim avolo olos. This is actually the earliest recorded machlokes in all of Shas. The earliest recorded machlokes is, are you allowed to do smicha on Yontif or not? Are you allowed to press down on an animal that you're bringing as a korban on Yontif? Beis Shammai are only the last in a series of earlier Tanoim, going back to the early stages of the Second Temple, who have a dispute about this halacha. It's actually the first machlokes recorded in Shas that goes back all the way back to the Zugos. It goes all the way back to the earliest of the Tanoim. And it says that Beis Shammai say you're not allowed to do smicha on Yontif. Beis Hillel say you can. And Beis Shammai say you have to do smicha the day before, on Erev Yontif, and you'll bring the animal the following day. That's machlokes number one. Machlokes number two is, are you allowed to bring an olas re'iyah on Yontif? Beis Shammai say no, and Beis Hillel say yes. Rava Amar Chagiga Kolzman. So that's the way that Rav Oshia says you interpret this brisa, is that this brisa goes according to Beis Shammai. Rava says, I'll give you another explanation as to what this 5-word brisa means. Chagiga v'cholzman chagiga me'achrin. You know what it means? Chagiga kolzman chagiga me'achrin tfeilo. All it means to tell me is, how long do I have to bring my korban chagiga if I neglected to bring it on the first day of Yontif? All the Mibraisa is telling me is, bring the korban chagiga, and you want to know how long you have to bring it? Kolzman chagiga ma'achrin. You can delay it b'di'eved for the entire Yontif period. So if you didn't bring it today, bring it tomorrow. And if you didn't bring it tomorrow, you have the entire 7 days of Yontif in order to bring it. Ditnan mishalo chag b'Yontif harishon shel chag chogeg v'holech es kol haregel kulo b'Yontif ha'achron shel chag. That if you didn't bring your korban chagiga on the first day of Yontif, you have the entire Yontif, including the last day, in order to bring the korban chagiga. However, over haregel v'lo chag eno chayv b'achor yusuf. But if the entire Yontif elapses and you still didn't bring the korban chagiga, it's for fallen. Avar zmano batel karbana. Once the time has passed, you can't bring the korban anymore. So that's all the brisa means to tell you, according to Rava.
Is Pesach Sheni an exception? Could you bring it?
Yeah, Pesach Sheni is the obvious exception. That's not a Yontif korban. It's an Erev Yontif korban. You bring that korban on Erev Yontif, you eat it on Pesach.
Yeah.
All right. Rav Ashi Omer Chagiga v'chol zman chagiga me'achrin va'afilu atzeres d'chad yoma me'achrin. So Rav Ashi says, I have another insight into what this brisa means. It's not just talking about a person who delays the korban chagiga, but the chiddush is, what is kol zman chagiga me'achrin? It's talking about when Yontif is only one day. When Yontif is only one day, which is when? Shavuos. And I neglected to bring the korban chagiga on Shavuos itself, I have an additional 6 days, just like by Pesach and Sukkot. That's the chiddush of the brisa. Kol zman chagiga ma'achron, that even on Shavuos, I have the same time that I would have for Pesach and Sukkot to bring the korban chagiga as a makeup. Ditnan modim shimchal atzeres lios b'Shabbos shiyom tavoach acher haShabbos. That even there's an elaborate machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and the Mishnah concludes by saying that Beis Hillel agree that if Shavuos coincides with Shabbos and you cannot bring the korban chagiga on that day, then you would slaughter it the following day and bring the korban on the day after Shavuos. Even though it's not Yantif anymore, you can still bring the korban Chagiga. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Natan Atiyah B'Purim, V'rachatz B'krona Shel Tzipori B'Shivas or B'Tamuz, U'Bikesh Lakar Tisha B'Av V'lo Hodula. So the Gemara now tells us, Rabbi Elazar tells us, that Rabbi did three things that were provocative. And the last thing that he did was not agreed upon by his colleagues. So what were the three things? He planted a plant on Purim, number one. Number two is that he took a bath publicly. I mean, I'm not sure it wasn't publicly, but he made sure that people knew that he was taking a bath on Shivas or B'Tammuz, meaning that he was telling people you're allowed to bathe, even though you have to fast on Shivas or B'Tammuz, you're still allowed to bathe on Shivas or B'Tammuz. And the third provocative thing that he did was that he wanted to completely eliminate Tisha B'Av. And on that, the Chachamim disagreed. They would not allow him to do that. So Amar Lafan of Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Rabbi lo kacha yamaisa, ela Tisha B'Av shechalios b'Shabbos hava v'tichinuhu la'achar HaShabbos v'Amar Rabbi hol v'nidche yidche v'lo hodu lo Chachamim. So he says to his Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar, he says, with all due respect, Rebbe, you're right, but you have to qualify that statement. When we say that Rebbe wanted to completely eliminate Tisha B'Av, it was only for that year that he wanted to eliminate Tisha B'Av. He wasn't calling for a complete eradication of the commemoration of Tisha B'Av. It was only that year when Tisha B'Av fell out on Shabbos, Rebbe figured that since we can't fast on the 9th of Av, there's no point on fasting the following day. And therefore, he wanted to dispense completely with the tainus just for that year. And that's where the Chachamim did not agree with him. They said, no, if you can't fast on the 9th, fast on the 10th. And Kari Alei, so when Rabbi Elazar heard the clarification from Rabbi Abba, his Talmud, he said, Tovim hashnai min ha'echad. It's better, two heads are better than one. In other words, you've helped me understand better the story, and thank you for that clarification. So the Gemara now says, V'Rebbe eichi natan atiyah b'Purim. Let's go back to the first thing that Rebbe did. He planted something on Purim. How could he do that? V'hatani Rav Yosef simcha u'mishta v'yom tov. The Megillah says that Purim is a day of three things: simcha, mishta, and yom tov. Simcha means happiness, mishta means drinking, and Yom Tov means holiday, right? So those three things imply three halachas. What are the halachas they imply? Simcha melamed shasur and behesped. The word simcha means you're not allowed to make eulogies at a burial. Mishta melamed shasur b'tainus. Mishta means that you're not allowed to fast on Purim. And v'yom tov, what does Yom Tov mean? Melamed shasur b'asiyas melacha. Means you're not allowed to work on Purim day. So how could Rebbe do work? How could he do malacha of planting on Purim?
Maybe for him, Simcha's pottering in his garden.
What?
People really enjoy it.
All right. So you'll see the Gemara is going to come up to that. The Gemara is going to discuss that issue. It's a good point, Alan. But the question is, Pashtus is malacha. You're not allowed to work on Purim, so this is malacha. What right did he have to do that? Ela Rebbe bar arbeisar hava v'chinata v'chameisar nata. So the answer is, says the Gemara, you're right. He didn't plant on Purim proper for himself. Rebbe, for him, Purim was on the 14th, and he planted the tree on Shushan Purim. So it wasn't Purim for him anymore. But the Gemara says, Aini, is this really so? You mean that Rebbe's Purim was on the 14th of Adar because he lived in an unwalled city? V'ha Rebbe b'Tiveria havo, Tiveria mekefes chumim yemos Yoshua ben Nun havai. Rebbe lived most of his life in Tiveria. And Tiveria, this seems like he also lived in Sipori, but for our purposes now, for most of his life, Rebbe lived in Tiveria, even though the Mishnah was...
close.
Yeah, it's very close. How far? Like a... Half hour?
By car.
Yeah, by car.
Not by camel, yeah.
Yeah. We didn't do it by camel. We did it by car. Anyway, but he wrote the Mishnah in Sipori, but apparently most of his life he lived in Tiveria. And Tiveria was a walled city from the times of Yehoshua. So how can you tell me that his Purim was on the 14th? So you're right. Rebbe bar chameser hava v'chinata bar beisar hava. So Rebbe lived in Tiveria. His Purim was on the 15th, on Shushan Purim, and he planted on the 14th. And that's why it was okay. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Umi pshitale de Tiveria mikefes chumim yos Yeshua ben Nun. Since when is it so pashut that Tiveria is a walled city from the times of Yehoshua? V'hachizki akari b'Tiveria ba'ar beisar uva chamesar mesafkele umekefes chamim yos Yeshua ben Nun hi lo. So the Gemara says, but Chizkiah, who also lived in Tveria, he read the Megillah both on the 14th and the 15th because he wasn't sure whether Tveria was walled from the times of Yehoshua or not. So therefore, Rebbe should have been machmer both days. The Gemara answer is, L'chizkiah mesafka leila Rebbe pshitalei. The answer is, you're right, Chizkiah was Mesupak, but Rebbe was not Mesupak. Rebbe was certain that Tveria was a walled city, and therefore he treated the 14th as any other day, and therefore it was perfectly fine for him to plant. But even if it was clear to him that he was in a walled city, it still should not have been permitted for him to plant on the 14th, because v'haksiv b'Megillas Tainis, es yom 14 v'es yom 15 yomei purya inun delolo mispad bahon. So it says in Megillas Tainis, which we know from learning Maseches Tainis just a few days ago, that this was the ancient scroll that had listed on it all the days when you're not allowed to fast and you're not allowed to have a hesped. And it says that included in those days is the 14th and 15th of Adar. The question is obvious. The question is, why does the Megillas Tainis have to record this if it's already recorded in Megillas Esther? So Rava answered that, and he said, "Va'amar Rava lo nitzracha elo le'asar eshel zeh bazeh ve'eshel zeh bazeh." That the reason why Megillas Tainis had to rewrite it, re-record it, is to tell me that not only is it Purim if you live in an unwalled city on the 14th, and Purim if you live in a walled city on the 15th, but it's also coming to teach you that even if for you Purim is on the 14th, you're prohibited from having Hesped and Tainus on the 15th. And even if for you Purim is on the 15th, you're prohibited from having Hesped and Tainus on the 14th. So you see that even though Rebbe was in a walled city, it should have been illegal for him to plant on the 14th. So the Gemara says, no. Hani mili behesped of Tainus of malacha yom echad v'sula. The Gemara says, no. You're right that if you have to celebrate both days, but only vis-a-vis fasting and Hesped is 14th and 15th both in operation. But as far as work, the rabbis only prohibited you from working one day. So if you live in a walled city, that one day is the 15th, and that's why Rebbe could plant on the 14th. So the Gemara says, Eini, is this really so? Once look at this following Maisa. Once Rav noted that a guy was planting flaxseed on Purim, and he cursed the plant and it didn't grow. Now, why would Rav curse a guy for planting if it's permitted to plant on a day that's not it's not your Purim? So the Gemara answers, no. Hasim bar yomahava. That's because the guy was planting on a day that for him was Purim, and that's why Rav cursed the plant. Now, Rabba berei de Rava Omar afilu tema biyome hesped v'taimis kabilu alayhu malacha lo kabilu alayhu. So he says a big chiddush. He says, you know what? Even if Rebbe was planting on the 15th, which for him was Purim, he was still within his rights. You know why? Because even though the Megillah does say that initially the takana was no hespedim, no fasting, no work, but the Jewish community only accepted the first two. They never accepted the prohibition of work on Purim. And how do you know this? Because look at the psukim. Ksiv demi kar ksiv simcha mishtav yom tov ulabasov ksiv lasosasam yemei mishtav simcha vilu yom tov lo ksiv. Because initially, the initial takana of the Anshe Knesset Hagdol of the time was all three, Simcha, Mishta, and Yom Tov, which includes not working. But if you look later in the Megillah, it only describes Purim in terms of Mishta and Simcha, which is no fasting and no Hespedim, but it neglects to record that it's a day of Yom Tov, which implies that the Jewish community said, rabbis, we're happy to celebrate, we'll have a big l'chaim on Purim, but we still need to go to work. So therefore, the Jewish community never accepted it, and therefore it never was in effect, and that's why Rebbe was justified in planting on Purim. So ve'ela Rav my time alachi le'ahu gavra. So then why did Rav curse the guy who was planting flaxseed? The Gemara answers, Dvarim hamutarim v'achirim nagu behem iser hava uva'asr de Rebbe lo nog. The answer is because in that man's community where Rav was, the Jewish community was machmir upon itself not to do malacha. It was not halachically required, but they were machmir anyway. That was the community practice. And if you live in such a community, you're not allowed to break stride from the community practice. And since the community practice was not to plant, was not to do malacha on Purim, Rav cursed the guy's plant. But Rebbe lived in an area where there was no such minhag not to work on Purim. He was completely within his rights to plant. The Ibayasema, that's one answer. I'll give you another answer. La'olam nahug. The Rebbe Natiyah Shel Simcha, this goes to Alan's answer. Really, the minhag on Purim is not to do malacha, and that's, and the Jewish community did accept it upon themselves in Rebbe's locale as well. Elamai, Rebbe was planting a netiyah shel simcha. He was planting something that gave him tremendous joy. There it is. Kidetnan avru elu v'lo nanu mematin b'masu umatin b'vinyanu v'netiyah be'erisunu v'nesuin. We learned in Maseches Tainus that if there's a drought and the rabbis institute a 13-day fast of Mondays, consecutive Mondays and Thursdays, and still it doesn't rain, what's the next resort? What's our last resort? We have to diminish, because it's a very sad time, we have to diminish our business activities, our building and our planting, and all marriages and engagements. So, Vitana Allah, binyan shel simcha, netiyah shel simcha. That when there is a restriction or curtailing of building and planting, it's not all building and planting. I mean, obviously, if you need a structure in order to live in, so then you're allowed to build. Right? What it means is building things that give you simcha and planting things that give you simcha that are not absolutely necessary. So what are examples? Ezehu binyan shel simcha ze'abona beis chasnus libno. It was the practice to build a lattice chuppah, right, or some kind of chuppah structure for your son in preparation for his wedding. So that you're not allowed to build. So that's called binyan shel simcha. And ezuhi netiyah shel simcha ze'anotiyah aburnaki shel malachim. And what's a planting of simcha? When you have a lattice gazebo, the practice was to plant ivy so that it would creep along the lattice and create this beautiful shady area where that was usually, it was a luxurious kind of place to recline and to enjoy the outdoor weather. So those are the things that are restricted in times of sadness. But on Purim, when the rabbi said don't work, they said only don't do work which are menial tasks. But if you're doing something which gives you simcha, that you're allowed to do on Purim. So Gufa. Chizkiya kari b'Tveria v'Arbeser v'Chameser mesafli mekefes chumim Yeshua ben Nunhi olo. So let's go back to that statement of Chizkiya that he read the Megillah on the 14th and 15th because he wasn't sure whether Tveria was a walled city or not from the times of Yehoshua. So the Gemara says, Umi Mesafli, why did he have such a suffix? Mi Mesafli milsa to Tveria, since when is Tveria a case of doubt? V'haksiv, look at what it says in Sefer Yehoshua. It says, Ve'arei mivtzar. It says that the fortified walled cities were Hatzidim, Tser, V'chamas, Rakas, V'chineres. These are the names of the cities. And V'kaimelon, Rakas zu Tveria. And we have a tradition that Rakas is none other than the city of Tveria. So you see from Sefer Yehoshua that Rakas, which is equal to Tveria, is a walled city. So the Gemara says, So the answer is, says the Gemara, you're right. We know historically that Tveria was a walled city from the times of Yehoshua. The suffix that Chizkiya had was that one of the areas, it's only walled on three sides, Tveria. But what's the fourth side? The Yam Kinneret, the water. So that's the question. The question is that called a walled city vis-a-vis Megillah or not? Okay. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Well, if that's the case, then that's surely not a walled city, because look at the halacha. The Tanya asher lo choma velo shur igar, and saviv prat l'tveria sheyama chomasa. There's a brisa that talks about the din of Batei Orei Choma. Now, Batei Orei Choma is discussed in Parshas Bahar. And it tells us the following halacha, that even though when you sell real estate in Eretz Yisrael, the seller has the entire, up until Yovel, to purchase it back, but if he sells real estate in a walled city, then he only has 1 year in which to buy it back. So the Brisa tells us, what is the definition of a walled city? So number one, Asher Lo Chama, that it has to have a wall, means to the exclusion of if it has townhouses completely surrounding the city, which was not originally built as a wall, but was just built as residences. That's not called a walled city. That's halacha number one. Halacha number two is that it has to be, the wall has to be completely saviv. It has to be bounded on all four sides, which means that if you have a city like Tveria, which only has walls on three sides, and on one side is water, that doesn't have the din of a walled city. So it should be fairly obvious that Tveria does not have a din of a walled city. So the Gemara says, no, Le'inyan batei orichoma lo mesafka lekika mesafka le'inyan mikra Megillah. Maybe the halachas are different, said Chizkiah. Maybe the laws as far as batei orichoma of real estate purchases and sales is one halacha, that if it's not walled on all four sides, it's not called a walled city. And the laws of reading Megillah, different criteria are applied as far as whether it's a walled city or not. My prazim, because the Torah makes the Megillah makes a distinction between prazim and mukafos. It says that if you're a prazi, if you're a free city, an open city, you read it on the 14th. So umay mukafin. So what's the contrast of a walled city? Dichsivi gabi mikra Megillah mishum dahani miglu v'hani lo miglu v'hanami miglaya odimla mishum dahani mignu v'hani lo mignu v'hanami mignaya mishum hachi mesaf galei. The question is, what does the word prazi mean? It's open. So what does that mean? It means that it's not completely encircled by a wall. So in that respect, Tveria is also prazi, therefore you should read it on the 14th. But maybe no, maybe prazi does not mean that it's not walled on four sides. Maybe it means that it's not secure. If it's not secure, then Tveria is a secure city. Just because it only has walls on three sides doesn't mean it's not secure. It is secure. It just happens to be that the fourth side of its security is water instead of a wall. So that's the question that Chizkiah had. What does the word prazi mean? Does it mean that it's unwalled, or does it mean that it's unsecured? And based upon the definition of the word prazi is the basis of his suffix. So now the Gemara says, Rav Asi kari Megillah behutzal ba'arbeser v'chamesar mesafkele umekefes chamimos yishu benun hiolo. Another case of doubt was the town of Hutzal. And Rav Asi therefore read the Megillah on the 14th or 15th because he wasn't sure whether it was walled from the times of Yoshua or not. Ika da Amri, Amar Rav Asi, Hai Hutzal de Beis Binyamin mukefes chamimos yishu benuni. Others learn that he said definitively that it is a walled city from the times of Yoshua, which means that he only read it on the 15th. Amar Rabbi Yechanan ki havina talia amilna milsa d'sha'ilna l'savia v'ishtakach kavasi. He says, when I was a young boy, I suggested an interpretation that I later asked the elders, and they confirmed that my interpretation was correct. That Chamas zu Tveria. Now, we had previously said that Rakas is Tveria in the pasuk, but now Rabbi Yochanan says no. My interpretation is that the word Chamas in the pasuk refers to Tveria as the walled city, and Velama Nikra Shemo Chamas. Why is it called Chamat? Al Shum Chamei Tveria, because of the hot springs of Tveria. And you can still go today and go find the hot springs of Tveria. But that the word Cham from the word hot. And Rakat Zot Tzipori, and the word Rakat refers to the city of Tzipori. V'lama nikra shema Rakas mishum demidalia karakta denahara. Why is it called Rakat? Because the word Rakat means a river bank. And just like a river bank is elevated above the water, so too the city of Tzipori is on a hilltop, so it's elevated above the surrounding areas. And Kinneret, the word Kinneret in the pasuk, what does that refer to? Zoginosar, that's the village of Ginosar. And why is it called Kinneret? Kinneret, the Mesiki Pera Kekala de Kinri, because its fruits are as sweet as the sound of the harp. It's got a beautiful sweetness to it, just like when you listen to a beautiful symphony and you say, oh, how sweet it is. So too, the fruits of Ginosar are very sweet, and that's why it's called Kinneret, from the word kinor, from the word harp. You all have a wonderful day.